talked to Linda ahead of time, and different things, and she just wanted, I guess you got that message, right? I talked to you on the phone. She really liked that, well, I called it, she called it executive summary, but it's, what you and I talked about. So
yeah,
the quicker that can get out to her, then the less, or all of them for that matter, then the less questions we should have on it.
okay, yeah, I can do that.
Yeah, because the semi, or short-term rentals is for December. We're gonna establish a public hearing date on November meeting. The other two has been established for November.
Oh, the short-term rental one, didn't even get the public hearing established yet?
Yes, it is gonna be December.
So you guys set that for December and
Right,
meeting on the 29th, and the other two were set for November?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
That's the way you wanted, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll be right back, John. I gotta grab a notepad.
How are you? I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Hey, what's going on there?
Morning.
Morning. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Yourself?
Good.
Let's do it, John.
Nothing much. Same old, How about you?
It's about the same as you.
Yeah. I'm anxious to see how tomorrow goes.
Yeah. I think you might pull it off.
Well, I Fox last night, listening to them, they were very optimistic that he was gaining an extreme amount of momentum.
I just listened to thing, was it in Georgia? They like had 120, it was like a separate, like YouTube, it wasn't like YouTube, but there was this company that were there. They said they had 125,000 attend that thing, and they had another 175,000 on their program listening to it.
Yeah, the rallies he's been having are incredible.
Oh, yeah.
And they go by these rallies. And they got a few Trumpers on the parking lot blowing their horns. But he didn't have anybody in attendance.
So, haven't heard all.
It's going to be interesting. I'm concerned about whether it's going to become fraudulent with all these write-in ballots that they're allowing. And, I don't remember what state
coming
it is.
in late. The ballots coming in.
They said there was one state, I don't remember which one it was. They were going to allow ballots to come in like 9 days after the meeting.
Yeah, doesn't make sense.
No. It's going to be interesting to watch.
Right.
I love watching on election night, and I think it's going to be entertaining.
Morning, Tom, Jerry.
Morning, guys.
Morning, guys.
Hi.
Tom, how are
I didn't recognize me. That mask.
How about with you, Tom? I put my mask on this morning out of the car, and all of a sudden my glasses got fogged up real quick. They were cold weather, I guess.
Yeah. Too early for this cold weather.
It's going as fast as it came, though.
Oh, I'm sick the rest of the week.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Indian summer, if you can say that.
And you're
Sure you can. They want that right, or-
Heather.
Holy cow. Look what the cat dragged in.
It's up on the Hickox. I don't know if you came that way.
Hickok?
Really
No, I
slow.
come middle
Yeah.
direction there.
Okay.
So 9:01. Can you guys on the computer hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a thumbs up.
Good morning, everyone. Before I turn the meeting over to Eric, I'd like to indicate to you that on Thursday night, the town board met and 3 different codes that we have been working on that was approved for public hearings. The NRI and the off-street parking public hearings have been set for November. The short-term rentals, a little bit more work to do on that, very little, and that public hearing is scheduled for December. Today, we're meeting to discuss local wetland ordinance. And I'm going to turn it over to Eric because he's been in touch with the speaker that we're going to have on this. And so, Eric.
Colin is here with us, as I understand, right, Colin? You, this is your job to delineate wetlands and run this at Deluxe. That does a lot of wetland delineation for our community, anyway, for people in the community. And you had reached out to and talked to the NRI project team last year, I believe, when they were drafting that NRI plan, and kind of asked if the town would be interested in looking at an ordinance at the local level to regulate wetlands. Can you give us like some background on it?
Correct. Good morning. My name's Colin Deal. I'm
Hold on, Colin. Muted. Maybe there's.
hear me okay?
I'm not.
He's got to turn it on. It is on.
Hey, Chuck, are you able? Do you
I can hear Colin. I can hear Colin, so it must be in your end,
Hear
Eric.
you.
We don't
either,
hear
Chuck.
you, Chuck.
I think it's
Hear you
on.
sign language.
Testing, testing,
Okay,
testing.
now we got you.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, good morning. So yeah, I'm Colin Deal. I'm owner and co-founder of Deluxe. We are a kind of a niche ecological environmental consulting firm based in, founded in Canandaigua, but now we moved to Bloomfield for a little bit of acreage. And we do a lot of work for MRB Group, Hunt. We work for Labella, Fisher, a lot of the major engineering architectural firms. We're a subcontractor to some very large companies like AECOM, Tetra Tech, WSP, Geosyntec, et cetera. So a lot of my work is directly related to compliance in the environmental field, specifically with regard to wetlands, freshwater wetlands, tidal wetlands, as well as threatened endangered species. I'm a graduate of the FLCC conservation program, as well as ESF's wildlife sciences program, where I do my undergrad work. Basically, I work with a lot of municipalities, formerly with MRB Group, obviously. So I stay very involved at the local government level. And one of the things that we deal a lot with is local wetlands permitting with a lot of towns, specifically downstate in the Westchester, Rockland, Orange, Putnam, different counties. A lot of that has to do with the New York City drinking watershed, but we do so much permitting in those areas that we see a lot of the values that the local permitting and local enforcement brings to those, basically the local government as well as the communities. So there's also a special permit revenue stream that comes in intermittently, obviously, through that process when need be. But it is, I know in New York State, that's a hot topic with the 2% tax cap. I learned a lot about that with MRB and kind of the pressures that local government sees from that. So I kind of look at it as a minor source of revenue, so to speak, but not really, because you're trying to avoid, minimize, and mitigate before you actually allow any type of permitting to proceed. So we came to basically anybody and everybody that would be willing to listen. But my main focus has been on communities that surround the Finger Lakes region, because from my experience, a lot of the wetlands that we delineate feed directly into the headwater streams and are basically the headwaters of the Finger Lakes. And not only that, but providing biofiltration and a wealth of other resource value to the communities. And I know the NRI has been focused on, obviously natural resources, One of those resources obviously would be wetlands in your community if you would like to maintain fresh water. So what I'm seeing in the background in my world on the consulting side is a lot of municipalities don't realize that they can potentially enforce regulations on Army Corps regulated wetlands with additional buffers. So I understand there's political pushback, there's developers that don't want to see this type of stuff, but I also think it provides a lot of value to developers if they do it and utilize it accordingly, which is again what we do on the engineering side, help those planners and developers do things the right way and utilize those resources the right way. So this has been an ongoing conversation on my end for probably 5 to 6 years. I've been pushing this concept and working in local permitting with a lot of municipalities for almost 15 years. So this is something that we have a lot of firsthand experience with. I'm actually working on 2 cell tower projects, both in Dutchess County right now, that have local wetland ordinance and local wetland permitting. So we also get the firsthand experience of going through that permitting process ourselves and seeing kind of how the ebb and flow works with the town, with the Army Corps, and with the DEC. So currently you have wetlands through the New York State Freshwater Wetlands Act that are 12.4 acres or larger, as well as one acre or larger if you're in the Adirondack Park or of unique ecological significance. So that kind of rules out a lot of the wetlands in our area in the town of Canandaigua, pushing a lot of the jurisdiction to the core. Under the current under the current Clean Water Act regulations, a lot of the formerly jurisdictional wetlands are now non-jurisdictional to some extent because of the updates to the Clean Water Act. And so there's a lot of non-jurisdictional wetland areas that I would highly recommend that the town pay attention to. And as of right now, there's really no tool in your toolbox to regulate those non-jurisdictional wetland areas, and developers could theoretically come in and fill non-jurisdictional wetland areas without much resistance currently. And I think that should change. Again, I was raised on Granger Street, Scotland Road, Chapin Road. I grew up in Canandaigua. It's my stomping grounds. I love the lake. I grew up with my grandfather hunting by the lake. I cherish the Finger Lakes region. That's why I've stayed here. And obviously, a lot of us stay here in New York State for certain reasons, but I will say family and the environment are my 2 top reasons. Not because of taxes, not because of politics. So I am extremely invested in this concept. I push it everywhere I go, to every municipality that will listen, that does not currently have this type of code in place. And we're always willing to kind of do pro bono work to help push these concepts forward, bring them to fruition, give the towns examples of other, wetland code for surrounding communities that they might not have been aware of, which I think is the case here, where there's wetland codes that are in proximity to Canandaigua that we probably weren't even aware of. So I'm going to stop there. I can keep talking all day, so I'll stop. But thank you for having me. I appreciate your time. Definitely.
Thanks, Colin. You guys want to ask some questions?
I personally need some kind of a Cliff Notes understanding of what we're talking about here. Deregulated wetlands. What the hell are they? And where's the DEC, the EPA, the Army Corps fit in? I mean, do you guys understand this?
No.
Okay, good. I don't either.
And that's why we're here. And obviously you have a lot of resources in your community, a lot of professional consultants. I know Labella is one of those consultants, and you guys work with MRB. So you're in good hands. You have a lot of folks that understand the regulations. That's what we do every day. I deal with the Army Corps of Engineers, Buffalo District, Auburn office, almost daily. And we talk to those folks. So basically you have, under the Clean Water Act, that regulates waters of the United States. And there are non-jurisdictional and jurisdictional areas. Obviously that is determined through what's called a jurisdictional determination process by the Corps. There's 2 different types of JDs. One is an approved, the other is preliminary. And they're kind of, you're giving the Corps jurisdiction under a preliminary JD, and you're kind of challenging it under an approved JD. And so that would be, the situation now is under the current 2020 Clean Water Act regulations. They've minimized what is determined to be jurisdictional wetlands a lot of isolated wetlands that might have had some connectivity to outside areas are basically non-jurisdictional in a lot of areas unless they're within proximity of a navigable waterway. So again, I can go on all day about this stuff, but you still might not understand it thoroughly because you really kind of have to have some kind of background in this process. I hate to say it. I could give you a full day presentation on Army Corps regulations and DEC regulations.
Colin, in short, the DEC, or New York State DEC, regulates some wetlands that are over a certain acreage, 12.4, you said. So if it's under that, they wouldn't be involved.
Correct.
The Army Corps, their jurisdiction is related to the Clean Water Act, and what are considered waters of the United States. And the revisions to the Clean Water Act have kind of shrunk what that jurisdiction is. And so now some wetlands are not regulated by the Army Corps. But you even mentioned that even if there are Army Corps wetlands, the town could, regulate beyond what their regulations are, enact a greater buffer or something to that extent.
Correct. And currently under the Clean Water Act regulations, you can, without mitigation, basically have approved fill up to 1/10 of an acre under a pre-construction notification, typically under a nationwide permit. So you're also potentially losing 1/10 of an acre here, 1/10 of an acre there without even knowing it, without you ever seeing it. And over time, there's a cumulative impact of that loss. And with cyanobacteria outbreaks, HAB outbreaks, I highly recommend, again, both on a legal level, an environmental level, a policy level, this stuff has to happen. Otherwise, if you haven't taken all the courses of action to protect those resources, if and when there is a lawsuit, there are grounds for somebody to say, have we done everything we can to protect this resource? And if not, what could we have done and why didn't we do it? And I'm seeing that happen in other high income areas, so to speak. Canandaigua was a high income area, but I'm talking closer to New York City. Seeing a lot of communities challenge areas that don't have policies, especially when you get a group, say if it's a cell tower, anti-cell tower group, or a solar array group that's oppositional, whether it's Golisano and his lakefront property and trying to figure out who he can go after because he can't swim in the lake or whatever reason it may be. There's a lot of Westlake Road taxpayers that are going to be very angry when they get reduced lake access over time. And that's happening. So again, I'm not, and this by no means is intended to be any type of fear factor. I think we're all very well aware of the have issues, and that's not my intent. My intent is to basically say, we have other tools that we could be adding to our toolbox. And if we don't, why aren't we doing that? Because I'm seeing other communities do it proactively without having the same level of HAB outbreaks in their community. So it's not only just a kind of a headwaters to these resources that we depend on for economic revenue and to bring people into our community. One of the reasons I live here is because of the actual freshwater resources. So I think, and that's what a lot of time draws people to the Finger Lakes, as we know. So we can do a lot more than we're doing, I guess is my point. Not saying specifically the town, but in general, there's more to be done. And I think
Colin,
that's just one step. Yep.
Colin, how have local regulations, restrictions held up in court? I know I'm old enough to remember the days when floodplain regulations were enforced or implemented, and a lot of the builders took exception, saying that it was condemnation without compensation. Now we're expanding that area of undevelopable land potentially. And have you seen any litigation in that regard regarding these types of regulations?
Yes, but typically it's always held up because it's been more strict than what the federal or state regulations call for, not less strict. So I think that in terms of floodplains, I would argue to any developer that you can develop in floodplains if you do it properly. If you elevate your buildings, if you do everything the way it's supposed to be done, it can be done. So if I'm an agency, I might say, well, I didn't keep you from doing anything. Just like this process and keeping anybody from doing anything, it just pushes them into a regulated process that is controlled by the town and not leaving it in the hands of the state which we all know the economic status New York State is in, the DEC, and I'm experiencing this with permitting right now. They don't have the man hour, they don't have the staff, they don't have the budgets, they don't have a lot of the time to keep up with these issues. Same with the Army Corps. The Army Corps' funding has been depleted. They're losing senior staff as we speak that are retiring, that are not being replaced. Your wetland resources are coming under kind of the gun. And I'll put it this way, no, I have not seen any situations where the town's lost because a developer came in. And I think if that were the case, it would be the town saying, well, we just don't want you to do it. I mean, if there's a plan and process in place for you to go through the permit and do it the right way and to avoid and minimize and mitigate, that's what we're looking for. And I think that's what any agency would support. And I know that I've seen town codes that are like, well, we regulate DEC wetlands. Well, that greatly reduces the amount of wetlands you can actually regulate, because 12.4 acre wetlands in a town, contiguous wetlands like that are becoming more rare.
Yeah.
And those large wetland tracts are obviously the more protected ones by nature, just because they're the large ones that everybody knows about. But it's the small pocket wetlands, it's these small resources that really cumulatively add to the value of the streams and the freshwater biofiltration aspects of the lakes. And again, I'm an FLCC grad. I'm Bruce Gilman's former student. I support 100% what we're doing, and that's why I said, hey, we see this on the background on these permitting projects that we do on a town level. Why don't we have that in Canandaigua? I mean, it just makes sense to us from a wetlands expert background. So.
Are there any, Colin, municipalities around us in this general area that have enacted, regulations such as what you speak?
Yes, there's a substantial list. Actually, I believe I forwarded it to the town already, but I can re-forward that, as well as the links to eCode 360, where you can see the actual codes implemented, which again, I mean, there's so many great examples, different kinds of examples that the town could pull from. And Eric, I think the last example I sent you was probably what I would consider to be the best one for the town, because it includes both DEC and Army Corps wetlands. It doesn't separate out or say we're only going to look at DEC wetlands, we're not going to look at Army Corps wetlands. And I think that's to me the best one. And I want to say that was pretty local. If you give me 1 second, I can tell you where it was. Sorry, give me 1 second. Town of Sweden in Monroe County has a very nice DEC and Army Corps. And again, those codes are available on eCode 360. They can be rapidly implemented and utilized. And I know MRB has plenty of, I don't know about wetland templates. And do you guys work with Labella on the code development, or is that something you do in-house? Or
We generally do code development in-house. If it's a larger revision, we sought help, like our conservation subdivision ordinance. We're working on revising, and we've retained Mavella to help us with that.
Okay. And again, I mean, from my perspective, we are, so to give everybody some perspective, most of the work that we do is federal level compliance monitoring and inspection for oil and gas activities, renewable projects like wind and solar, water and sewer line, transportation, telecommunications, and private land development. So we have some pretty robust compliance and inspection programs in place right now. Actually, Deluxe just went through a 4-company merger with 3 other companies in Pennsylvania that all specialize in threatened endangered species, stormwater inspection and compliance, environmental inspection, and ecological consulting. So we have probably more resources than ever. One of the things that we've talked about in the past is how if you implement this code, how do you enforce it? How does the planning board review a project? How does it flow from start to finish? And one of the tools that you guys commonly use is the Encore system. to review projects from a planning board perspective, and I use it all the time myself. It's a great resource. What I personally think is there are grants out there where we could literally fly the entire town with a drone and get very high resolution imagery, including spectral and thermal. We could utilize that for GIS layering into the Encore system at a town level, which would give the basically the planning commission a lot more information at their fingertips to look for potential wetland areas that are not mapped by NWI. So just so everybody's aware, National Wetlands Inventory Mapping was developed for waterfowl habitat management, not for wetlands regulation. It is not a regulatory, it's used as a regulatory tool, even though it's not supposed to be. So National Wetlands Inventory polygons, sometimes they're very incorrect. They're very irregular. When we delineate them, we find that they're often very incorrect and inaccurate. So there are other resources out there. We're also working on some with an artificial intelligence company where we can auto delineate wetlands using basically a combination of data layers, but that's kind of a ways out still. So, but I think that just having GI Encore, I mean, you could literally go in, and if there's a question, your consultant can say, yeah, that looks like a wetland, or it's not. And if you need somebody to go out and look at a site, all you need to do is take a picture and send it to your consultant and say, does this look like a wetland to you? Most wetland consultants should be able to say, those plants look like wetland plants, that looks wet. At least from a perspective of looking at things remotely, which I know is on everybody's mind right now. And that's a lot of what we do is stream imagery remotely to, consultants, engineers, architects, etc. So there's ways of dealing with it, both now and in the future. And I will say that a lot of the towns that we deal with downstate have their in-house engineers. And if they have a wetlands issue come up, they typically will send it to their engineer and say, is this an issue or is it not under our code? And if so, why? And what kind of permit do they need? Go from there. So it's really, it is a straightforward process. It might not sound like it, but it's not hard. It's just something that I think everybody would have to adjust to a little bit, and somebody would have to be on that checklist of, yeah, we looked at wetlands, but did we look for town regulated wetlands, not just NWI and DEC mapped wetlands? Because again, if you don't fall in a polygon, that does not mean you're not in a wetland. A lot of the time, I would say, 65, 70% of the wetlands that we delineate are not mapped. So if that puts anything in perspective.
DEC must have maps, do they not, of all the wetlands that they regulate?
They do, and those are 12.4 acre wetlands or larger, especially in areas outside of the Adirondack Park, where they would start mapping smaller 1 acre or larger polygons. And then you have the National Wetlands Inventory Mapping System, which has a lot of polygons that are it's this tool that most people use to go say, are there wetlands near my site or not? But again, it's used for waterfowl habitat management, but it kind of evolved into a regulatory mapping system where people look at it for that purpose, but it shouldn't be. There should always be looking at multiple layers of data to figure out if you actually have wetlands on site. And then if there's a question, you actually go out and investigate or delineate. So that's our process. So I'm trying to wolf my coffee down here still this morning.
What do you know? I mean, it sounds like part of this would be, or would, best be getting more data on local wetlands, but do you have an estimation on like the extent of, let's say unregulated or just Army Corps regulated wetlands in the town of Canandaigua?
I don't, but we can do it. With the GIS capability, we can do a rapid assessment on that very easily.
So you
to give you acreage of DEC and Army Corps separately or both.
But you expect that there certainly are some. I'm just curious, what the extent and potential benefit of regulations would be. Of course, if there are no wetlands that we regulate and we enact this, what's the point? If there's there's a higher benefit.
One of the things that I would emphasize is that with this, you can implement buffers on these resources that typically didn't have buffers on them before. So if you have a intermittent stream, or say if you have even a small wetland stream that is not a class CT or higher, so it's not regulated under Article 15 of the DEC, or ECL, you would have basically the Clean Water Act will come into play, and regulation would of that water course stops at the ordinary high water mark, not the banks, not the top of bank of that stream. And I know the town has some additional code for stream protection, I believe, right? Isn't that a new thing?
Not really. We have 100-foot buffer from essentially a DEC regulated stream.
So
Or
anything
net.
anything not class CT or higher or navigable would then fall into that non-jurisdictional category for the town. That's my understanding.
I think, yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
Okay, so then in that situation, you have a 100-foot buffer, but everything else doesn't. Every other stream out there does not. How many of those streams do you think you have a candidate? I mean, if you did an assessment of the ones you're going to regulate under that code, then you probably should have information on what was non-jurisdictional under that code. So I bet a lot of streams are non-jurisdictional under your code, as well as there are no buffers on any of those streams, which you could enforce through this code that we're talking about. So adding buffers to Army Corps wetlands where there were no buffers, you could literally develop up to the edge of that wetland without getting a permit or conducting regulated activities by the Corps definition. So my suggestion is buffers are a very important factor in wetlands. Buffers are a very essential component to keeping wetlands healthy and intact. Whether it's invasive species establishment, whether it's just basically keeping a level of filtration of surrounding, say if you have a turf grass, you know, everybody's building their houses and they've got their turf grass all the way up to the edge of the woods. People want to go as far as they can till they can't mow anymore and their mower gets stuck, right? So they're basically going to mow up till the wetland edge if they can. And then say they have a sprayer, you know, a lawn spray company come in and spray. I mean, that's just one example of how you can get direct impact on some of these fertilizers, chemicals directly without having any buffers established. So we're not trying to keep residential homeowners from cutting some trees down in their backyard and having turf grass. That's not the point. The point is if you have a big development or development of any kind, you have some control over what type of impacts are being completed within proximity of the resources that feed your main resource. So again, it's kind of like, let's focus a little bit less on the lake and go back outward to everything that feeds into the lake and protect those areas first, because as it goes into the lake, it's going to be filtered even more if we have more buffer, if we have more protected wetlands, more protected stream buffers. It just makes sense, honestly. And it's hard to say this doesn't make sense in this community, especially. That's my opinion. So
Having not looked through the examples that you provided, generally, is it enforced by like the planning board, the zoning board? How does it work? And is it generally just a buffer? Is it more complicated than that? Or is it, you know, a buffer seems relatively simple to do, and you know, the zoning board might enforce that, but
I've seen different codes. Obviously, there's different examples out there. Some of the codes I've seen say, well, if it's a wetland that is less than 2 acres, we're going to put a 50-foot buffer on it. If it's a wetland that's greater than, you know, if it's 2 to 7 acres, 2 to 10 acres, we're going to put a 100-foot buffer. And you could go, I've seen towns down in Westchester go up to 300 foot. I don't think that's necessary. And I think that would be controversial, but I think 100 to 50 foot is very reasonable and very workable in any type of site design. And we're not saying you cannot do anything in that buffer or that wetland. Obviously, when you get into the wetland, then you're getting into the core jurisdiction, right? So if it's a core regulated wetland, you're going to only regulate the buffer and the wetland. Or I'm sorry, you're going to regulate the buffer and the wetland. The Corps is also going to regulate the wetland. So what you would typically do in that situation is you would kind of rely on the Corps to make their determination first before the town would approve a permit that was in place. And that's my experience is we submit to the town says, hey, great, thanks, appreciate the application. Tell us what the Corps says. And then the Corps will come back and say, well, we approve this nationwide permit, or we authorize this under a nationwide permit. Then the town says, okay, we feel a lot more comfortable about the fill you're going to do in the wetland area. In this area, the Corps has approved it. okay, now we're willing to approve our impacts in this buffer that we regulate. And that's typically the process that I've seen. And also with the DEC, I've got a site right now that has DEC regulated wetlands, Army Corps regulated, and town regulated, and it's all the same wetland is regulated by all three agencies. So we're coordinating simultaneously with all three agencies. The DEC basically pushes and says, tell us what the Corps says. So the Corps will tell us, then we tell the DEC, then the DEC says, okay, we feel good about this. Then the town feels good about it because they have that 100-foot buffer too. So it's this, like, you kind of have to wait, if they're only impacting the buffer, then you work with them. Can you avoid it? Step one, can you avoid it? If you can't avoid it, why not? If you get, okay, step two, minimize it. Step three, mitigate it. And mitigation is a kind of a separate topic, because for you to require mitigation for buffer impacts in a town regulated buffer, that gets more sensitive, because mitigation, especially off-site compensatory mitigation, becomes very costly. So does on-site, as well as are you going to make them monitor the mitigation site 5 years later? Like, there's a lot to mitigation. So you can put caps on the amount of buffer impact to say, we're going to allow or be able to permit up to this much buffer disturbance. And these are the things that we don't constitute as disturbance. If you have, I know some areas, they're okay with pervious things. They're okay with a little bit of gravel. They're okay with some tree hand clearing with turf grass. You start getting into pavement, you start getting into infrastructure. But if you're keeping it more naturalized, that might be something you want to allow. Just, kind of call it out very clearly. Obviously, you get into calling everything out at that case. But yeah, the planning board would review it. The planning board would, if necessary, call in the help of their engineer if it got complicated. But typically, it's going to be a very straightforward scenario where you're going to have a little bit of buffer impact, and that's it. And the town's going to say, okay, submit your special use permit for the town resource buffer impacts. And here's our list of criteria. It doesn't have to be complicated. And again, I have lists from other towns, if you'd like those too, for requirements for their permit applications. So we can, it's easy to kind of simulate what other towns are already doing and have done.
Thanks, Tom. Do you guys have any other questions for Colin?
No.
Okay. Well, we'll talk it over and whatnot, and hopefully get back to you if we need any more information, or if we're moving forward, all that good stuff.
And again, I'm a consultant. I make money off consulting, but this is, for me, not about making money. This is a hit close to home in my heart spot. And I want to make sure that the town understands that if you'd like me to come in, if you want to have more meetings, or whatever you need. To me, this is something that should happen, that needs to happen. And if I can help in any way, please let us know.
Cool. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to log off now. I got to drive down to Pennsylvania.
Good luck. Take care.
Be safe, everybody. Thank you.
A whole lot more complicated than I anticipated.
Right, Pam. And just,
Well, what the hell, what's a wetland? What's a regulated, unregulated? Whose job is it?
I didn't realize there were so many kids.
Oh, likewise.
I think it sounds like the regulation itself probably wouldn't be that complicated. It doesn't have to be, like a buffer, as long as you also have that data layer that gives you a better idea of where it is. But it's the same thing as what the planning board would do now, where if there's NWI DC, they're gonna say, map it, and then send it to the Army Corps of DC.
Presently, we rely on who for this, whether it's a stream or not.
Well, the DEC has their streams mapped.
Designated as stream. And then we get into intermittent streams, which are really drainage ditches, which our highway department has created all through the town.
Or
Those
farmers.
type of things are gonna get mapped.
Probably, yeah. It sounds like that's what he's saying.
And then you're gonna have buffers. I can see a lot of pushback on what an intermittent stream is.
Tom, look at all the farmers who have streams running through their property. Can you imagine
Absolutely.
a 100-foot buffer from the stream? And maybe it's good agricultural management, but in the same regard, they're going to say, hey, you're taking away land that I can plant crops.
The other way to look at it, though, if you look at the goals here, 3 and 4, 3 was ensure the protection of Canandaigua's natural resources, and 4, which isn't checked, protect Canandaigua Lake and its watershed is a major natural resource. So the filtration part of this is so obvious that
It's
we have to do it. And the other one that
valid.
we probably wouldn't deal with in Canandaigua, but where I used to live in Lima, we had a wetlands connected to our property. We had that 9 acres. And out there, they didn't run services. So when the golf course went to 36 holes, they basically went underground and came up, lo and behold, with water. And our wetlands wasn't the same anymore. And so you have that with a water table issue. Now around here, that shouldn't, if there are services happening, you wouldn't have that. But if you don't, you know, a lot of this has to do with water table. And we're assuming that that's going to be stable when we're dealing with this. And the only thing that's unstable is storms and weather. But you have to be careful, even with developers. You know, would they be messing with the water table in terms of what they're doing? Generally, I don't think they do, but that's something that you need to do, because the water table is messed with, and your wetlands issue, it totally changes.
Well, like Chuck indicated there, the DEC is only going to be looking at, or is only regulates Class C streams or higher.
Right.
Now, you know, the small areas that aren't regulated, who's going to map them out and determine where they are?
Based on what he said, they would, or that would be like the first kind of part of this, it seems.
Is this going to be something that the Conservation Committee is going to look at? I mean, I don't have any idea. I'm on it, but we've only had a couple of meetings because of the pandemic.
I can't recall what Joyce said, but I think that they're interested, and I'm not sure what the extent of their involvement would be. I mean, certainly they can't do the mapping of it. And from what he's saying anyways, it would require flying, I think it was, what was it, infrared or something like that? Different types of mapping or whatever, so.
And then it would become part of the NRI.
I don't know if it would become part of the NRI, but it might be loaded onto like Encore for use there. Yeah.
I guess it'd be interesting to see what other communities and what do these regulations actually say? How detailed are they? Whether the town of Sweden apparently is, from what he said, one of the closest ones to us. What have they done? Just to get a feeling for what he's talking about.
And going back to Bob's comment, what's the hydrology in Sweden as opposed to here when you get into things that are important like water table?
I meant to ask, but I forgot. I wondered if he had talked to like Kevin O'Many and then with the watershed. See what their thoughts are.
What I'm hearing in summary, what this gentleman, Mr. Deal, was suggesting is that we regulate wetlands less than 12.4 acres and streams that are not currently identified as streams by DEC. And I think that some of that probably is relevant, but I think what also goes along with that is what is the expense for the town to do that type of mapping and research and then to illustrate it somewhere? Because when someone comes in to buy a piece of property, if their property doesn't have a designated wetland on it somehow that they could identify pre-purchase, then I think there becomes an issue with whether it was a wetland or wasn't a wetland, and what that person's allowed to do with that property pre-purchase versus post-purchase. And it becomes a legal issue at that point. Because if you get to the point where you tell that person that, oh, you've got 10 acres of wetland on this property, and it was not designated as such pre-purchase, and they had the idea of developing some of that 10 acres, then it becomes an issue, I think.
And
I
how
think
is
that's
that?
what Chuck was kind of saying. You get into the taking
Yes.
of the available.
Of the available developable
Yeah,
space.
Yeah.
So I think there's an extreme dollar value, and I don't know what extreme is, maybe I'm exaggerating, but I think there's got to be a little research done about what the cost of the potential mapping could be to the town before you go down the road of whether you want to regulate it or not regulate it, because you don't know what the size of the wetlands are, where they are, how many of them there are, and what you want to do with them. So I think the first step is to identify what the cost of this mapping would be.
The other thing too is you've got short-term and long-term. And you gotta get people to buy into the long-term, that if the lake is cleaner, then if that's our goal, then you back up to all the things that you have to go through and endure. And then I also wondered about farmers' ponds. People like ponds. Now that is related to this in the sense that a lot of times water will pass through, filtrate, and then move on. Do you see that as part of wetlands?
I would think that ponds are probably considered wetlands.
And
Well,
they're pretty common in town of Canandaigua.
You drive around in the hills, off 21 up into the hills and around, you count the number of ponds,
Right.
just naturally occurring ponds. Places loaded.
Yeah, and they're vital with the filtration. We even have them on our Morel lot behind where we have the holding ponds, and they all add up to something. They have a large import.
So it goes back to what he said, a little bit less focus on the lake and more focus on what's feeding the lake
Exactly.
is important. And it goes along with what you pointed out, number 4, I think it is.
Yep.
On the list there. They probably need more information before we do anything.
And I forget when we were doing this, by the numbers, were those prioritized, by the numbers, those were the most important, or just they came out that way? Okay.
You want to move on to the next item?
Sure.
You mind if I move that list over here? We're talking about let's do the water course setback one real quickly. So as you guys know, we're working on the language for the setback to streams, essentially revising the definition for water course to do what we've been doing anyways, to say that the DEC calls it a stream or defines it as a class C, whatever above, which we show on all our maps, then it requires a 100-foot setback. It's kind of how we've always interpreted it, but the wording on it was weird. We changed it to make that clear, and we referred it out to the different bodies. Nobody really had a comment back that they were opposed or requested changes. So if the committee wants, we can move that one forward as a local law to the town board for them to set a public hearing.
It's made it through all the committees and everything, right, Eric?
Yep.
Get a motion then that we move that forward, or do you want the committee to look at it further?
I say move it on. I know the planning board talked about it in quite detail. I think that the only concern, Eric, was in the comp plan, the mention of 150 feet versus the 100 that we're putting this regulation.
Yeah, the open space plan says 150.
I think 100 is fine.
Yeah, I think that was kind of, I know we talked about it, but even the ECB didn't make the comment about 150. It's in the open space plan. And I think even Kevin O'Malley had said that it's unnecessary on most streams, probably.
Okay, I'll make a motion that we move it along.
Make it a second.
Second.
Motion made and seconded. Is there any discussion? If not, then we'll vote on moving it forward for the public hearing. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Okay, carried.
What one do you want to do next, Gary?
Well, the pools, we've had that for quite a period of time. We haven't addressed it. It was before the pandemic that we really worked on that.
That chicken.
Where are we with the pools? This is in the RLD.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think we pretty well had that or had it.
I thought, yeah, I thought it had gone out of committee, but that's all right.
Right, and we had, there's 3 or 4 of them like that, but before the pandemic hit, we had them, and then all of a sudden we come to a screeching halt. Because there was the pools, the lighting and manufactured homes, so the 3 that we worked on and had it ready to go.
the most significant one.
when I was looking at that, and it's probably in the definition of a pool, is there a differentiation between a in-ground or above ground hot tub as opposed to a pool? What do we decide? there?
Probably, so hot tubs are defined as pools, so any delineation between an in-ground hot tub and an above-ground hot tub really relates to an in-ground pool and an above-ground
Okay.
pool. And so there is definitions for that.
So it's defined, okay.
Was there anything else, Tom?
No, I just, it just, that came to mind when I was reading this last night.
The ECB had probably the more major comments on this one. They wanted it to be more clear on how it's drained, how a pool is drained.
Well, we say not into the lake.
Shall not drain directly to neighboring properties or can be the lake.
Yeah.
But they were saying, if you drain it into a storm drain, let's say, is that directly into Canandaigua Lake? Or a septic system, if you were to drain into a septic system, that's certainly not good for the health of it.
I'll say.
I don't think you'd do that.
Yeah,
Don't
probably-
say.
Well, they probably physically could, it'd
But-
be damn stupid.
That's how you flush it out.
A lot of cities look as though don't even realize they're on septic.
Yeah. The point is, I think that they'd like it to be more clear, I guess, as to how it gets taken care of. I mean, if it was pumped to like a truck or something and drained offsite, that kind of makes sense. But if you're draining it over the land into a stream or something like that, where's it go? I mean, if you're not on sewer, where's it go?
Goes to the lake eventually.
Right.
That's where it goes. Unless you happen to be below the lake.
Or it goes into the water table.
Well, wait a minute, most people don't drain their pool
No.
because they collapse, right?
Particularly
yeah.
in ground with pools.
Yeah,
It'll
you
not only
need
collapse,
water in it
it'll
to
pick up.
keep the pressure
Yeah.
equalized.
Yeah, the liner will come off there.
It'll push the
Yeah.
water table will push the pool out of the ground if it's not full.
It's loaded.
The only time that you would really drain an in-ground pool is if you have a gunite or something like that that has a liner. You had to replace the liner. That's the only time you really drain it. I've had ours have been in 21 years. I've never drained the thing. Hot tub, flush that a few times a year, but I can't tell you where that water goes. It goes underground. Where it goes. Where does that water go?
It goes in the water
Water
table and the ground filters it.
Well, right here, we're only talking about the RLD. So it's not like upward or whatever, likely wouldn't.
Yeah.
consider water table.
But again, a hot tub is, mine got about 600 gallons. I mean, if it's an 8 foot by 8 foot hot tub, that's about what they hold. So, I mean, that's what you're kind of looking at. It is something bigger, yeah, it's going to have more water, but it's not, like a 20,000 gallon pool.
How many times a year do you do that?
2 or 3 times a year. Not during drought. though.
So my understanding, nobody.
Okay, what alternative or what embellishment did the ECB suggest?
I didn't suggest anything.
Not only that, how are you gonna regulate it? You can't.
Bingo.
I mean, why get something on the books if you can't regulate it?
Good, good.
Then there's another question. Simplified state. Oh, hot tub. Sorry. Okay, hot tub. Pools were not allowed before, and the town is now stating pools are allowed. Well, pools were. So. I just want to be clear, I guess. I think this question largely related to whether above ground hot tubs were previously allowed in the RLD. And based on what it said before, that in that case, that above ground hot tubs weren't allowed. They were in ground. They would have been on the side yard.
And how many exist that we don't know about?
Probably not.
The other one I never was sure about was if the hot tub is in the deck, is that above ground or is that in ground? You know what I'm saying? That you build a deck and it's at the same level as the deck. Is that in ground? Is that in ground or is that above ground?
Hire a lawyer.
Well, in that vein, one of the questions I have previewing this is, how are we gonna classify pools that are partially above grade and partially below grade?
I'll get to it right here. I think it's a matter of like the percentage of the water that's underground.
Oy.
Swimming pool, sorry. Above ground having less than 3/4 of its water content
Okay, good.
below the level in ground 3/4 above. Okay.
Good.
So probably with your question about the deck would be considered above ground.
Yeah, right.
Are we still dealing with the ECB's comment, or are we having another conversation?
Let me just touch on one thing. real quick.
Okay, go ahead.
So again, just getting back to whether above ground swimming pools or more above ground hot tubs were allowed in the RLD beforehand and whether they should be allowed. The ECB's thought is that above ground hot tubs should be allowed. I think is what they're doing. But I'll leave that up to you because I think our discussion was kind of only if it was below ground, whatever, but that would be.
I don't think we much care, do we? Whether it's in a deck or on a deck or in the ground.
As far as
At the CBA, when we were trying to live by our wits, there was a time when it did seem to matter. But my memory is clouded now, whether all that makes sense, today. I think we were looking at aesthetics, and a lot of these people said that they were gonna put the fancy shrubbery and all that stuff. And we sort of, we went with that, and we also said it wasn't gonna be, the level wasn't gonna be too high. I mean, you're basically saying, like, you're gonna excavate to put a hot tub in, right? I mean, or not. Doesn't just about everybody dig a hole if they're putting a hot tub in?
No.
No,
they don't.
Oh, a lot of them put them
I don't
in built-in decks or on decks.
Oh, okay.
I thought,
8x8 like I did.
I thought when we discussed it, that we came to the conclusion that any hot tub had to meet the same specifications as a pool.
Okay.
You don't really put them in the ground, you have to have access. In case the heater dies or pump or something like that, you know. One whole side comes off and you go in and work on the guts of the
I
thing.
got you. That makes
Most of them are above ground. Or on a deck.
So leave it as is.
Committee, Agreement on that? I think it is. Okay.
Yep.
Did you have something on this one, John?
I do. Something that is very dear and true to my heart, and which I'm very passionate about. And my interpretation of paragraph 4, bullet 3 says they shall be included as part of lot coverage as measured by the water surface and all adjoining impervious surface. Therefore, my interpretation says that if it is pervious, it's not included as part of the lot coverage. That is currently inconsistent with our codes. I think our codes need to be modified relative to that, first off. But I think that this is in direct conflict with our current codes. I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah.
Pavers are a structure according to the town, which I think is, excuse my French, but I'm going to be as passionate as I am about it. Bullshit. And for us to go and delineate between pervious and impervious here, but not throughout the rest of the code is not fair. Bullshit. Thank you. So
it's a relatively simple change to this one, I would think, to make it in, not to essentially correct what you think is bullshit, but to bring it into
understand.
conformance,
yes,
to just say all adjoining structures.
yes. However, pavers are not a structure. I will argue that till the cows come home. But in our interpretation of whether it's a structure or not for the town, that's a bigger and broader issue, which I think we ought to, as a committee, and I've said it before, come to terms with here and have a discussion about it. But yes,
And in the what's happening in the ZBA, if people are moving to pervious, then we're playing, let's make a deal. When they say they're doing that with their add-on or whatever, along with the water garden or whatever they call it, that kind of stuff. That's
Rain
when we-
garden.
Rain garden, that's when we start playing, let's make a deal.
rain gardens are ridiculous also, and I'm willing to have a conversation about that with anybody as well. They're not maintained. They're not really used for what they're supposed to be used for. And there's a question about how effective they are. I mean, you don't have to put a rain garden in, you could put in a dry well, same thing, works just as well. But that's a whole different conversation. I don't want to get us off track about that, but I just wanted
Well, I
to
just
share my
wanted to mention
passion
that-
about it.
There are the rules and then there's the game. And CPA, people to get their variances, sometimes they've done a scouting report and they know how the game goes. And that's the reality.
And the reality is, Bob, and I agree with everything you just said.